rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes, and this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world, and then shall the end come.
Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?
Welcome to Tuesday's edition of End of the Age, everybody. I'm Dave Robbins, and I thank you for joining me today. And it's a pretty good day here at Endtime. Everything's going real well, and I'm just happy to be with you today. So, on today's program, we're going to be talking about the Paris COP21, the climate change conference going on over in Paris. And you've all been watching it on the news, you've seen it on the internet, and there's a lot of different things going on. One of the major things that has stuck out to me over the course of all the speeches and everything that I've read about it, all the speeches I've heard, is that there's no mention of God. You'll see as I go throughout the program today that God is not even mentioned in any of this. They're looking towards a humanistic solution. They say humans caused the problem, so humans have to solve it. And they think that by keeping the the carbon dioxide emissions at a certain level or lowering them, that we can lower the temperatures of the earth. Well, to even think that we could do something like that is just beyond me. I don't see how these guys come up with that. And that's why, as you'll see as we go through the program, it's totally fabricated because they have an agenda, a global government agenda behind everything. But as you go down through here, like I said, there's no mention of God at all. Of course, that's if you go to the United Nations and you talk about the United Nations at all, I've been there several times, there's no mention of God at all. They say God, but they don't mean Jesus Christ when they say God. They're trying to be all-inclusive and include Muslims and Buddhists and Hindus and everything they all say, well, He's God. But there's no mention of Jesus Christ. And so it's a key thing when you follow this stuff. It's all humanistic solutions. There's no God, there's not a God factor in any of it. If they would all turn to God, even if climate change was a problem, which it's not, it's all a complete hoax. But if it was a problem, humans could never solve that. We would have to look back to God for a solution on something of this massive of a scale. But of course, it's a hoax. And there's no God solution to any of it because it's simply a hoax. There's nothing to fix. So let's talk about, with that in mind, let's talk about the Paris COP21 or the climate change conference that's being held starting yesterday and will be held through December 11th in the next couple weeks. There's a lot of speeches, a lot of different things going on, and from a prophetic standpoint, we look at this from Revelation 13, 1 through 8. It describes a world government that will be established on the earth just prior to the second coming of Jesus Christ. Well, the Paris Climate Conference is a huge step in the establishment of that world governing body. And so that's why we follow it. I've been following it very closely, and in our magazine, we've written several articles on the global warming and the climate change and the Pope's encyclical and this Paris conference. Why did we write all that? Why are we even tracking it? Because they're using this as an agenda to push us farther along into their already established one world government. And the Bible says in Revelation 13, there's going to be a world government established just prior to the second coming of Jesus Christ. So that's why we follow all this stuff, because it's prophesied in the Bible. So let's look at the COP21, the climate change conference going on over in Paris as we speak. So here's the consensus. Here's what this is all about. It's the man-made global warming theory. You've all heard about it, but that's what's kind of driving this thing from a humanistic standpoint. It's the impact mankind has on the temperature trends of the planet, and it's known as anthropogenic. It's human-caused Climate change. The view that man's combustion of fossil fuels significantly warms the Earth's atmosphere, and it's called the enhanced greenhouse effect. The anthropogenic or human-caused global warming theory has been defined as the idea that the Earth naturally keeps a stable atmospheric temperature over time, and that human activity, primarily in the form of CO2 emissions from industrial activity, is primarily responsible for the unhealthy warming of the Earth's atmosphere. Supporters of this man-made climate change theory frequently assert the existence of a scientific consensus favoring their viewpoint. The science of global warming, they say, is settled. Well, absolutely, we know it's not settled. Science is never settled. They're constantly trying to disprove science, the theories. They've tried to disprove Einstein's theory of relativity. There's no science that's settled. Any true scientist would tell you that. But when you look at what they're trying to do through these climate change conferences and all these different things, they say, well, it's settled. We've got to fix it. Talk to a true scientist and they'll tell you, one that's not backed by globalist finances, and they'll tell you the science is never settled. So it's one big thing you can look at that says, hey, this is a hoax. This is not true. It's a hoax. So in talking about COP21 or the climate change conference that's going on in Paris, there's 5 things you need to know to help you understand what's going on when you watch it in the news. What's this really all about? And this comes from CNN. What is COP21? Well, COP stands for the Conference of Parties. And it's an annual meeting of all nations that make up the United Nations framework on climate change. 195 nations in total. And this is the 21st meeting, thus COP21, with the first occurring back in Berlin in 1995. So the purpose of the meeting is to continually assess the nation's progress in dealing with climate change and ever so often negotiate agreements and set goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions that are the primary drivers of climate change. So what's the goal of this climate conference? Well, the goal for COP21 is pretty clear-cut. It's to achieve a legally binding agreement with universal participation among all nations to keep global warming below what most scientists say is the critical threshold of 2 degrees Celsius of warming. And this, of course, refers to the increase in globally averaged temperature since the Industrial Revolution began. So who's going to be at this conference? Well, there's more than 40,000 delegates from 195 countries all around the world. In fact, this is the largest conference the French government has ever organized of any kind. So, what is necessary for it to be a success in the eyes of globalists? Now, it's not a success in our eyes because we see this as a complete, utter hoax. They're spending millions of dollars on a hoax. But in the eyes of the globalists, the people who believe in a world government, internationalists, to be a success, the goal is very clear for COP21. It is necessary for the nations to unanimously adopt a legally binding agreement that will reduce global carbon emissions and aim to keep global warming below the 2-degree threshold. Why is it important to you and me? Well, this comes from CNN. This is not what I believe. This is from CNN and a globalist's standpoint. Assuming that you plan on living on this planet for the next 2 decades, as opposed to joining the Mars One colonization project, you will be affected by climate change and should care about the outcome of the Paris Climate Conference. Now again, this is coming from CNN. This is not Dave Robbins or Endtime Ministries. This is CNN's viewpoint, as it will be critical in framing the international response to man-made climate change. A warming climate will lead to more frequent and extreme heat waves, droughts, and flash floods. In addition to extreme weather, melting glaciers and ice sheets are raising sea levels, which will continue to affect the lives of hundreds of millions of coastal residents worldwide. Other effects, such as water scarcity and changes in food supply, will also accompany climate change and, like most of the other effects, will hit the developing world disproportionately. So even as the holiday season is in full swing in December, take a minute from your shopping and keep an eye on the proceedings in Paris, as the fate of the world as we know it could be at stake. Well, from end times perspective, from Dave Robbins or Irvin Baxter, the question is all this true? Is the sea levels rising and everything melting, and there's going to be these cataclysmic disasters if we don't come up with a humanistic solution to solve all this and, decrease the amount of carbon emissions that we emit? Is all this true? Well, the answer is no. I used to call the global warming and climate change fiasco a hoax until I looked up the definition of hoax. I now think that the word hoax, which could sometimes mean a prank or a practical joke, is not a strong enough word. No, the message that man-made global warming, which causes climate change, is destroying the planet, is an outright lie, folks. We're being lied to. This whole thing, which they're over in the climate change conference over in Paris, that they're spending they've spent billions promoting over the past several years, and they're spending millions and millions of dollars over the next couple weeks. All of these meetings, all of the dinners, the hotel rooms, all of the flights there and back, they're spending millions of dollars. And it's all an absolute lie. And it's easily proven. One way to prove global warming, which leads to climate change, just a real simple way to prove it's a lie or a hoax, is take a look at Greenland today. The Norse Vikings arrived in Greenland around 980 AD and were able to farm the land at that point. However, due to the rapidly cooling climate, they were forced to leave by the mid-15th century, and their settlements were abandoned. Currently, if you look at it today, 80% of Greenland is covered in ice, which means, now this is very critical, that it was much warmer when the Vikings were there than it is today. So, my question is, did the Vikings have coal-burning plants? Well, no. Did they drive large SUVs emitting carbon dioxide? Well, absolutely not. Yet the global warming alarmists say that the coal-burning plants and SUVs and different things, that these are the cause for global warming and must be abolished. So isn't it easily proven it was warmer back then than it is today in Greenland? Now 80% of it's covered with ice. But yet more CO2 is being emitted today than ever. So consequently, it's a complete, absolute hoax. Look at all the money that's being spent over the next couple weeks and has been spent in promoting the climate change conference. And believe me, if they get what they want, this legally binding deals to decrease the amount of carbon emissions that are emitted by all of the developed nations, it will cost billions and billions and billions of dollars. The Blaze goes on to state, the climate change conference is aimed at the most far-reaching deal ever to tackle global warming. The last major agreement was in 1997, and that was the Kyoto Protocol, and it required only rich countries to cut emissions, and the U.S. never signed on to that. Among several sticking points, of course, is money. How much rich countries should invest to help poor countries cope with climate change? How much should be invested in the renewable energy, and how much traditional oil and gas producers stand to lose if countries agree to forever reduce emissions? With that in mind, at least 19 governments and 28 leading world investors were announcing billions of dollars in investments to research and develop clean energy technology with the goal of making it cheaper. Backers included, of course, Obama, he's a one-worlder, Microsoft co-founder Bill Gates, Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg. They're giving billions to this. Billionaires George Soros and Saudi Prince Alawid bin Talal and Jack Ma of China's Alibaba. Under the initiative, 19 countries pledged to double their spending on low or no carbon energy over the next 5 years. They currently spend about $10 billion a year, about half of that from the U.S. In a separate announcement, the United States, Canada, and 9 European countries pledged nearly $250 million to help the most vulnerable countries adapt to rising seas. droughts and other impacts of climate change, which is a complete hoax. Germany pledged 53 million, the U.S. 51 million, and Britain 45 million. All of this money, just think of this, millions and millions of dollars to something that's not even occurring. The money will be made available to a fund for the least developed countries hosted by the Global Environment Facility. And that is a major funder of the environment projects worldwide. So there's two kinds of pledges for you to watch for. As you're reading the news, watching on TV, there's two kinds of pledges for you to watch for that will affect you and I. The first one is the pledge to lower emissions. President Obama's speech at COP21, he called for a binding agreement with regularly updated targets. So they're not going to set necessarily the targets. They'll set a target in the beginning, but then they're going to regularly update them to further restrict people who are emitting carbon. The question is, who will manage these legally binding, regularly updated targets? Well, who put together the climate conference? The United Nations, the world governing body. And then let me prove it to you how I know the United Nations will oversee this. Look at the Sustainable Development Goals that were adopted by every nation unanimously in September. Goal number 13 is the goal number 13 is to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. And then it says, acknowledging that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is the primary international intergovernmental forum for negotiating the global response to climate change. They tell you, they're not even trying to hide it. They're telling you the United Nations is the only entity on earth set up to globally manage all of these pledges that are being put forth and to make sure that they happen. They want teeth. They want them to be legally binding. They want these people to pledge, but then they want to make sure that they do what they pledged. And then the second kind of pledge you need to watch for are financial pledges from developed countries to help fund the development of underdeveloped nations. Well, of course, this is wealth redistribution, which, by the way, is one of the major planks in a socialistic society. And of course, the United Nations was designed to be a socialistic one world government. In 2010, during an interview, you say, well, let's talk about wealth redistribution for a second. In 2010, during an interview with Germany's NZZ Online Sunday, a UN official, Otmar Edenhofer, declared, "We distribute de facto the world's wealth by climate policy." They're not even trying to hide it. All of this climate change and all of these different things, all of it is a scheme so that they can redistribute the wealth of developed countries to underdeveloped countries. Think about a socialistic society. One of their major planks is wealth redistribution. So I want to read you just an excerpt from this interview to show you how it went and how this came out from the UN official. The interview went as follows. The news station made the comment, "The new thing about your proposal for a global deal is the stress on the importance of development policy for climate policy. Until now, many think of aid when they hear development policies." The UN official stated, "Well, that will change immediately if global emission rights are distributed. If this happens on a per capita basis, then Africa will be the big winner, an underdeveloped nation, and huge amounts of money will flow there." Where's that money going to come from? It's going to come from developed nations, European Union, the United States, all of these developed nations. And this will have enormous implications for development policy. And it will raise the question, if these countries can deal responsibly with so much money at all, what are they going to do with it if they get the money? Then the news source says, well, that does not sound any more like the climate policy that we know. The UN official stated, basically, it's a big mistake to discuss climate policy separately from the major themes of globalization. The climate summit at that time in Cancun at the end is not a climate conference, but one of the largest economic conferences since the Second World War. Remember, this was in 2010. Well, why? Because we have 11,000 gigatons of carbon, and this is 5 years ago, in coal reserves in the soil under our feet. And we must emit only 400 gigatons in the atmosphere if we want to keep the 2-degree target. They had the same target back then. Well, 11,000 to 400, well, there's no getting around the fact that most of the fossil reserves must remain in the soil. Well, the news source asked the UN official, de facto, this means an expropriation of the countries with natural resources. This leads to a very different development from that which has been triggered by development policy. The UN official said, okay, first of all, developed countries have basically expropriated the atmosphere of the world community. But one must say clearly that we redistribute de facto the world's wealth by climate policy. It came right out in the interview. The climate policy is a wealth redistribution scheme. They're not even really trying to hide it anymore. Obviously, the owners of coal and oil will not be enthusiastic about this. One has to free oneself from the illusion that international climate policy is environmental policy. This has almost nothing to do with the environmental policy anymore, with problems such as deforestation or the ozone hole. So, you ask yourself, well, man, this is wealth redistribution. It's a big scheme. Everything going on in Paris right now is a scheme. It's a scam to redistribute the wealth from developed nations to underdeveloped nations. You say, well, we're talking about, remember, the world government is prophesied in the Bible, Revelation 13, to be established just prior to the second coming of Jesus Christ. So the question is, what does wealth redistribution have to do with world government? Well, after World War II, the United Nations was founded as an international organization to maintain peace and security by developing friendly relationships between nations and promoting social progress. The idea behind this institution sounded great until it was discovered that the charter establishing the UN was drafted by a convicted communist spy, Alger Hiss. So with a communistic agenda driving the mechanics of the organization, it's easy to see how the global elites have been able to work from within the UN to quietly build a world government. A socialistic world government is the goal. Ever since the charter was written originally, it was designed to be a socialistic world governing body. And it's the goal, and the belief in global warming is the number one vehicle to reach that goal. One of the core belief systems of socialism is that most conflict in society stems from an ever-broadening gap between the wealthy and the poor. The contention is that the wealthy are the ruling class and will inevitably use their economic power to enforce their will upon the less fortunate. The ultimate socialist solution to this problem is to abolish private property ownership, for the state to own all principal means of production, with the central government redistributing wealth evenly among the masses. If you have too much, hey, let's take some from you and give to somebody who hasn't worked as hard. But that's a socialistic plan. The result would be a classless, communistic society where a global government would ensure equality for all citizens. So if you remember, you've heard in some of the speeches lately on television, it's all about equality, equality. We need to take from the rich, give to the poor. Even though the rich person has started a business, he's went through the stress and pressure of putting up with employees and getting the business off the ground. He's been a success. Now he's a millionaire. But hey, you're a little bit too successful, and so who wasn't willing to go to college and wasn't willing to do this, let's take some of what you have and give to this person. That's a socialistic principle. It's called wealth redistribution. Well, it would be impossible to fully realize the dream of a communistic one world government without the redistribution of wealth from the developed nations to the poor, underdeveloped nations of the world. Folks, what's going on in Paris, the climate conference, is the entire goal of the whole thing, their agenda, is the next step towards a fully functional world governing body. So is this conference, COP21, going on in Paris, is it important to the believers in a one world government? Man, you better believe it is. Absolutely. One way to explain this is to look at the events leading up to the climate change conference. Millions and millions of dollars have been spent over the past several years preparing for the current conference taking place in Paris. President Obama, along with others, has stated this conference is a turning point in the future of our world. UNESCO, or the United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, stated in early 2015 under the heading, Major 2015 Events, Driving Momentum for a New Development Agenda. UNESCO is gearing up for a year of major events. This is early 2015, which will drive our advocacy for a new global development agenda to follow this year. The year will culminate in a series of activities which we will host for COP21. Now remember, these are the events leading up to COP21. It started in early 2015. They've spent millions on this. And COP21 obviously is the 21st session of the Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And it takes place, obviously it started yesterday, and it's go on for another couple weeks. It states, we will do everything possible to press for the adoption of an effective climate agreement that will keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius, protect the most vulnerable, alleviate poverty, and create a future with prosperity for all. So, here are just a few of the events that led up to the current climate change conference taking place in Paris. And I tell you what, I'm coming up to a break here. So what I'm going to do, I'll dive into these events that led up to this Paris conference, but let's recap. In the Bible, Revelation chapter 13, it's prophesied that there will be a global government established just before the second coming of Jesus Christ. And we're talking about the climate change conference, COP21, currently taking place in Paris, France. And it's the next step from a prophetic viewpoint. It's the next step in getting us to this world governing body. The entire agenda is to tighten the noose on the citizen of the world and lead us into the world government prophesied in Scripture.
We here at Endtime are excited about the 7 seals. The 7 sales of the season. Endtime Ministries has 7 great Christmas gift ideas full of meaning and truth for your loved ones to open on Christmas Day. On Wednesday, get 50% off all video and audio downloads. Take advantage of this deal to enhance your prophecy library, starting at just $1.99. On Monday, December 7th, get a 2-year subscription to Endtime Magazine for only $20.15. Endtime Magazine explains current events through Bible prophecy on a bi-monthly basis. Keep listening in the coming days to hear about the rest of our sales. Not a bad idea to keep listening to know what the 7 seals are as well. Happy shopping!
Hey, this is Anthony from the End of the Age Control Room. So I know some of you are about to turn your radio off because your station only carries the first 30 minutes of End of the Age. We're sorry about that, but we have good news because now is your cue to turn your computer or mobile device on and head on over to endtime.com. There, click the watch button to continue to listen or watch the program. You can also finish up later by going to endtime.com and click the archives link.
Hey, Anthony, we need you in here.
Well, there's my cue. I got to go get ready for the next half of the show, so just head on over to endtime.com and we'll see you there for the next segment of End of the Age.
Welcome back to Politics and Religion, everybody. I'm Dave Robbins, and we're talking about the climate change conference that's occurring right now. You've been watching it on TV, you're following it on the internet. What's this climate change conference all about and going on in Paris? Well, it's the next step in the prophesied world governing body to be established just prior to the second coming of Jesus Christ. So, is this climate change conference important? An important next step? Absolutely. Look at some of the events that took place this year leading up to this. They spent millions and millions and millions of dollars to promote it, and of course, they got a Pope Francis, to help them along the way. So, some of the events leading up to this climate change conference. In June, Pope Francis published an encyclical devoted to climate change, and his proposed solution was a world government. He called for a global authority to manage all of this. In July, at the Vatican, Pope Francis hosted 60 mayors from around the world to keep pressure on world leaders ahead of this climate negotiation conference in Paris by designing the document Modern Slavery and Climate Change. The document states, human-induced climate change, which is a hoax, is a scientific reality, and its effective control is a moral imperative for humanity. Then, from July 7th through the 10th, an international conference of Our Common Future Under Climate Change, UNESCO headquarters in Paris, was a very significant conference. It was the scientific event of the year on climate change. More than 1,000 scientists established the current state of research, and they discussed measures to mitigate and adapt to climate change. In September, of course, Pope Francis gave 3 key speeches here in the United States. From September 23rd through the 25th, he gave 3 speeches here in the United States, and the first one was in front of the President of the United States and many distinguished guests at the White House. The second one was to a joint session of Congress, and then the third was at the United Nations just before the nations of the world voted unanimously to adopt the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. While speaking at the United Nations, he said, "It must be stated that a true right of the environment," he actually said the environment has rights like humans does as part of our human family, does exist. Because we human beings are part of the environment. We live in communion with it, and since the environment itself entails ethical limits, which human activity must acknowledge and respect, any harm done to the environment, therefore, is harm done to humanity. So these are the Pope was saying that we almost need to treat the earth and the environment like one of our human family. They have that we're connected with them. He went on to state the adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development at the World Summit, which opened at that point, is an important sign of hope. I am similarly confident that the Paris Conference, now remember this was in September, the Paris Conference on Climate Change will secure fundamental and effective agreements. So the Pope was calling for this back in September at the Sustainable Development Conference. And of course, according to the International Institute for Sustainable Development, way back in February, the UN General Assembly President, Sam Katista, proposed adjusting the beginning of the summit to 11 on the 25th of September to allow for an address by Pope Francis at 9 a.m. to be the first speaker so he could set the tone so the Sustainable Development Agenda would be passed. And of course it was. This is the same meeting where the United Nations adopted the new set of Sustainable Development Goals. So these are the same Sustainable Development Goals that include a goal to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. Then The Guardian stated that by the time the Paris conference starts, the biggest emitters have already committed to. They weren't looking to maybe commit to something in November, December at this Paris conference. They've already committed to it. They went there prepared and already committed to. The EU will cut its emissions by 40% compared to 90 levels by 2030. The U.S. will cut its emissions by 26 to 28% compared to 2005 levels by 2025. And China will agree that its emissions will peak by 2030. So notice how the Pope and political leaders work together throughout the year to prepare the world for a successful COP21 climate agreement. The Bible specifically prophesies a union of politics and religion in the end time. The political side will run the world government, and the religious side will lend its support and influence to this world governing system. So as you can see, COP21 is an absolute move by the United Nations and the political leaders of the world to establish a world governing body. So how will this affect you and me? Well, at this point, we can only speculate because obviously the conference isn't over yet. But these are some of the things you can watch for. However, the Brookings Institute, one of the most influential think tanks in America, has set forth a possible scenario of what to expect after COP21 if it is successful in the globalists' eyes. They state, number one, that these are things you can watch for according to the Brookings Institute. The foundation of the Paris Agreement are intended nationally determined contributions, or INDCs. that governments agreed to submit last year in Lima, Peru at the COP20, setting out actions against climate change beyond 2020, including pledges to limit and reduce their annual emissions of greenhouse gases. So that's one of the things you can look for, and many of the nations have already brought that to the table. Number two, look for an integration of carbon pricing on an international stage. Well, of course, wealth redistribution, what this is going to do is exactly what carbon cap and trade laws are designed to accomplish. The government will set a cap on the amount of carbon emissions that an industrial nation can emit. If the limit is exceeded, carbon credits can be purchased from underdeveloped nations who have more credits than they need. Well, this, of course, has nothing more than a wealth redistribution scheme set up by the United Nations and the global elite. Money will flow from developed nations to underdeveloped nations, and all it is a wealth redistribution scheme. It's not going to solve anything. The third thing we can speculate will happen after this climate conference would be increased public policy in sustainable infrastructure, of course, to be administered under the authority of the United Nations. They're looking to get teeth with this thing. And then full implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals over the next few years that were adopted back in September. The ultimate outcome of the sustainability agenda is a massive transformation of social, political, technological, cultural, and behavioral processes that impact how mankind produces and consumes. In other words, sustainability affects every aspect of life on Earth. Green initiatives attempt to modify human behavior to reward us for how we eat, work, travel, and play more sustainably. Sustainable development is a catchphrase used by activists and government agencies involved in the implementation of Agenda 21, which, according to the UN's own website, is a comprehensive plan of action to be taken globally, nationally, and locally by organizations of the United Nations system, governments, and major groups in every area in which humans impact the environment. So the ultimate goal of Agenda 21, if you don't know what that is the control by the United Nations and a future one world government of all human settlements, determining where one can live and what land should be used for. Sustainable development equals world governing policies to control the citizens of the world. That's what it's all about, and that's one of the things you can look for as a result of this climate change conference. So, the current climate change conference is nothing more than another move, among others, towards a one world government. And it's the world government that's prophesied in the Bible. It's the same one to be established just before the second coming of Jesus Christ. So if you're asking yourself, are we really living in the end time? I really don't know if we are. If I just had one proof, I could prove it using this right here. But of course, there's tons of other proofs which we don't have time to get into today. So think about it. Global warming, which leads to climate change, is an absolute hoax. Like I said before, they have spent millions of dollars preparing for these 2 weeks. They will also spend several $1 million during these 2 weeks. And for what? What are they doing in Paris? What they're doing means nothing. It is all geared towards the establishment of a one world government. If they totally did away with carbon emissions, it wouldn't solve anything. All the plant life would die, actually. That's the only thing it would do. It's not going to solve the heating up or the cooling down of the planet. God controls all of that, not mankind. These people are overstepping their bounds. They're dreaming if they think that we can control the climate. It is a hoax. But, of course, God is not on the mind of any of these people. They're looking for humanistic solutions. Consider this. The Daily Caller published an article titled, "Obama's CO2 Plan Will Only Avert 0.001 degree of warming per year." So if you want to know, is this a hoax, listen to this article. President Barack Obama formally submitted his plan to cut U.S. carbon dioxide emissions to the UN, and a climate scientist already pointed out a glaring problem. The plan that Obama has laid out and that he's given to the climate conference just yesterday, the plan will have virtually no impact on global temperatures. So what are they even doing there? That's the question. Obama's carbon dioxide reduction plan commits the U.S. to 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025, a promise he made last year to secure a pledge from China to reduce its own emissions. But Obama's plan will only avert 0.001 degrees Celsius of global temperature rises a year, according to this climate scientist Chip Knappenberger with the Libertarian Cato Institute. Knappenberger notes that Obama's climate plan mirrors a scenario where U.S. reduces carbon dioxide emissions 80% by 2050. So using this assumption, Knappenberger calculates that only about 1/10 of a degree of temperature rise will be averted by the year 2100. So think about that. What are these guys even doing? This breaks down to about 1/1000th of a degree of averted temperature rise every year over the next century. The cost for this? Well, it's not clear, but EPA regulations aimed at cutting carbon dioxide emissions from the energy sector is projected to cost as much as $8.8 billion per year based on agency figures. Other studies put the cost much higher. A NERA study found the cost could be as much as $41 billion per year. Well, Republicans have protested Obama's recently unveiled climate plan, saying that it would be impossible for the U.S. to make such deep cuts to CO2 emissions. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell of Kentucky said in a statement, even if job-killing and likely illegal Clean Power Plan were fully implemented, the United States could not meet the targets laid out in this proposed new plan. Considering that 2/3 of the U.S. federal government hasn't even signed off on the Clean Power Plan and 13 states have already pledged to fight it, our international partners should proceed with caution before entering into a binding, unattainable deal. Democrats have backed Obama's plan to reduce emissions. The White House says this plan will galvanize international support behind a global climate treaty, one they plan to impose without congressional approval. I didn't think they were supposed to be doing that. Looks like they're planning on it anyway. So when we get back from the break, we'll finish the program, and I got a real neat article that I want to read to you that really puts this in a clear perspective. And so join me when we come back. And it's really a great article because it really lays out what's really going on and how much of a hoax that this global warming climate change really is.
With holiday greetings, send prophecy teachings and be of good cheer. It's the most wonderful sale of the year. Buy 3 Understanding the End Time 14 DVD sets and get 2 free. With our generation being the end time generation, it is so important for every single person to go through this series. You can give that understanding to your friends and family. And the love you'll be showing, their hearts will be glowing when your gift appears during the most wonderful time of the year. Call 1-800-END-TIME to order today.
Ever wish that there was a newspaper that just reported articles that related to Bible prophecy? Well, Endtime.com has just that. We have stories fresh off the press that you can get on the Prophecy in the News page. Reporting daily, we make sure that you know the latest that is going on in Bible prophecy. You can also join the conversation, discussing articles with others, and asking questions about the news stories to our staff. We've got extra, and you can read all about it by going to endtime.com, and on the homepage you'll find Prophecy in the News.
Welcome back, everybody. We're talking today about the Climate Change Conference, or COP21, that's taking place in Paris as we speak. And we know that they're saying that what we want to do is have a legally binding agreement that all the nations would agree to cause them to reduce the amount of carbon emissions that they put off that they say is leading to global warming, which causes climate change. And of course, they've scared everybody to death by saying, Obama just made a speech about, hey, when I was in Alaska, There were villages that were being swept over by the ocean and they were being destroyed, and that the glaciers were melting and everything, and there were tundras that were burning up. I actually heard this in a speech that he made. You know what, folks? None of that actually is true. Global warming and climate change is not occurring. If we have a hurricane, it's because weather conditions were right to have a hurricane. If a volcano goes off, or if we have a wildfire out on the prairie, it's only because conditions were right for that. It's not because of the carbon emissions that we're putting off that's heating up the planet. Global warming hasn't occurred for about 19 years now. I think it's up to like 18 years and 8 or 9 months. So we're at a plateau here where it's actually not happening. Some articles that I've read have actually said that some of the polar caps are actually expanding and not getting smaller. So global warming, climate change is an absolute hoax. And what I recently read an article published in the Heartland Institute by Dr. Patrick Moore titled, "Why Am I a Climate Change Skeptic?" And it's a very, very, very good article. It's one of the hundreds of very informative, logical articles that will help put all of this into view about the entire global warming, climate change debacle, and it'll help us get into maybe a little more correct perspective. Now, Patrick Moore is a PhD. He has been a leader in international environmentalism for more than 40 years. He co-founded Greenpeace and currently serves as chair of Allow Golden Rice. Moore received the 2014 Speaks Truth to Power Award at the 9th International Conference on Climate Change on July 8th in Las Vegas. So the article states, and why I'm reading this is because it's prophesied in the Bible. Obviously, we're going to have a world government. And the way that this, and we're focusing today on this climate change agreement, COP21 that's going on in Paris, and how it's another step towards this world governing body. And they're saying this global warming, climate change, the planet's heating up and it's causing the climate to do crazy things. And so I wanted to read you this article from Dr. Moore because it puts everything in perspective. It's very clear cut and it just cuts through all the fat and gets right to the meat of it because it's so crystal clear. The article states, I am skeptical that humans are the main cause of climate change and that it will be catastrophic in the near future. There is no scientific proof of this hypothesis. Yet we are told the debate is over and that the science is settled. Well, my skepticism begins with the believers in global warming, climate change, certainty that they can predict the global climate with a computer model. The entire basis for the doomsday climate change scenario is the hypothesis increased atmospheric carbon dioxide due to fossil fuel emissions will heat the earth to unlivable temperatures. In fact, the earth has been warming very gradually for 300 years now, since the Little Ice Age ended long before heavy use of fossil fuels occurred. Prior to the Little Ice Age, during the medieval warm period, Vikings, of course I talked about this earlier, but it's so key. Vikings colonized Greenland and Newfoundland when it was warmer there than it is today. And during the Roman times it was warmer, long before fossil fuels revolutionized civilization. The idea it would be catastrophic if carbon dioxide were to increase and average global temperatures were to rise a few degrees is preposterous. And I totally agree, Mr. Moore. Recently, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, announced for the umpteenth time, we are doomed unless we reduce carbon dioxide emissions to zero. Effectively, now think about this, effectively, this means either reducing the population to zero or going back 10,000 years before humans began clearing forest for agriculture. This proposed cure is far worse than adapting to a warmer world if it actually comes about. So here's the IPCC's conflict of interest. By its constitution, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has a hopeless conflict of interest. You say, well, what's the IPCC? Well, it is a group of scientists that are funded by the United Nations and different globalists to come up with the science to support global warming and climate change. They can't really do what real scientists should do. They've got an agenda behind their scientific research, so they have to make what they come up with say what the United Nations wants. So, in light of that, they have a hopeless conflict of interest. It's man-made is to consider only the human causes of global warming, not the many natural causes changing the climate for billions of years. We don't understand the natural causes of climate change any more than we know if humans are part of the cause at present. If the IPCC did not find humans were the cause of warming, or if it found warming would be more positive than negative, there would be no need for the IPCC under its present mandate. To survive this entity, it must find on the side of the apocalypse. The IPCC should either have its mandate expanded to include all causes of climate change, or it should be dismantled. So you can see the IPCC, they're trying to prove a hoax. Imagine being in that situation. So think of it, a political powerhouse. Climate change has become a powerful political force for many reasons. First, it is universal. We are told everything on earth is threatened. Second, it invokes the most powerful human motivators, which is fear and guilt. I'm afraid the earth is going to be destroyed, and I feel guilty because we're destroying it. That's what they're using here. We fear driving our car because we're going to kill our grandchildren, and we feel guilty for doing it. Third, there is a powerful convergence of interest among key elites that support the climate narrative. Environmentalists spread fear and raise donations. Politicians appear to be saving the earth from doom. So when you hear one of the presidential candidates say, we're all about climate change, we need to solve it, you really need to take a second look and think again about what they're really saying here. The media has a field day with sensation and conflict. Science institutions raise billions in grants, and they create whole new departments and stoke a feeding frenzy of scary scenarios. Business wants to look green and get a huge public subsidies for projects that would otherwise be economic losers, such as wind farms and solar arrays. Fourth, the left sees climate change as a perfect means to redistribute wealth from industrial countries to the developing world and the UN bureaucracy. There's that wealth redistribution again we talked about. So we are told carbon dioxide is a toxic pollutant, that it must be curtailed, when in fact it is a colorless, odorless, tasteless gas and the most important food for life on earth. Without carbon dioxide above 150 parts per million, all plants would die. You understand that carbon dioxide is plant food. So if we decrease all of our carbon dioxide, all the plants die. Human emissions have actually saved the planet. Over the past 150 million years, carbon dioxide had been drawn down steadily by plants. It's plant food for about 3,000 parts per million to about 280 parts per million before the Industrial Revolution. If this trend continued, the carbon dioxide level would have become too low to support life on Earth. Human fossil fuel use and clearing lands for crops have boosted carbon dioxide from its lowest level in history of Earth back to 400 parts per million today. At 400 parts per million, all our food crops, forest, and natural ecosystems are still on a starvation diet for carbon dioxide. The optimum level of carbon dioxide for plant growth, given enough water and nutrients, is about 1,500 parts per million. So nearly 4 times higher than today. Get this, greenhouse growers actually inject carbon dioxide to increase their yields. Farms and forests will produce more if carbon dioxide keeps rising. We have no proof increased carbon dioxide is responsible for the Earth's slight warming over the past 300 years. There has been no significant warming for 18 plus years, while we have emitted 25% of all the carbon dioxide ever emitted. Carbon dioxide is vital for life on Earth, and plants would be more with it. So which should we emphasize to our children? Celebrate carbon dioxide. The IPCC's followers have given us a vision of a world dying because of carbon dioxide emissions. Well, I say Earth would be a lot deader with no carbon dioxide, and more of it will be a very positive factor in feeding the world. So let's celebrate carbon dioxide. So you understand, folks, let me do a recap here before we finish the program, that what's going on at COP21, the conference, the climate change conference being held in Paris as we speak over the next couple weeks. If you look at it, you'll be watching it on TV, you'll be listening to it on the radio, you'll be watching it on the internet, following it, reading news articles on it. What's really going on? You're trying to decipher what's going on. Well, it is simply a huge step towards the world government to be established on earth just prior to the second coming of Jesus Christ. They're looking to further promote the Sustainable Development Goals that were adopted in September. Number 13 of the Sustainable Development Goals is to curtail and to take control of climate change here on earth. Now, they're not looking to God for a solution. They're looking for humanistic solutions. What they've chosen to, their proposed solution is to reduce all the carbon emissions on earth. And they're saying that that is what's producing the global warming, which produces the climate change. And the earth is going to sweat to death and it's going to burn up if we don't cut these emissions. So what they're wanting to do is they're wanting to start taxing people that are burning coal and emitting carbon. And they're going to funnel that from developed countries to underdeveloped countries. And it's called wealth redistribution. It's one of the main platforms that the United Nations is using for wealth redistribution, because remember, the United Nations was established to be a socialistic one world governing body. And to be a socialistic world governing body, they have to equalize the playing field. So they can't have rich nations and abject poor nations. So they have to equal them. Well, they're sitting here saying, hey, we're the world governing body. We need to equal this out. So let's get everybody scared enough and afraid the world's going to burn up because of hurricanes and all these different things that they say are happening because of climate change. Let's get everybody in fear mode. Let's use fear tactics, and and they will accept us taxing them to the point where we can redistribute the wealth from developed nations to underdeveloped nations. So COP21, the climate change conference going on in Paris, is the next step towards the establishment of a world governing body prophesied in Revelation 13. And now you know what's going on in Paris as we speak and over the next couple weeks.
End of the Age is a production of Endtime Ministries. This broadcast will be available on our website, endtime.com, in the archives section. On our website, you'll also find more information about how current events are fulfilling Bible prophecy. To reach our operators, call 1-800-ENDTIME. That's 1-800-363-8463. Endtime Ministries is partner supported. We would like to say thank you to our partners who made this broadcast possible. To do what Matthew 24:14 said, to reach the world with the gospel of the kingdom.